The morning fog clung to the ancient pines surrounding Hollow Creek Sanctuary like a burial shroud, and by the time groundskeeper Marcus Chen arrived for his dawn shift on October 15, 2019, he knew something was terribly wrong. The silence was absolute. No morning bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, no gentle sounds of the sanctuary's carefully maintained ecosystem awakening to another day. Even the wind seemed to have died during the night, leaving the 847-acre wildlife preserve in an unnatural stillness that made Chen's skin crawl. Marcus had worked at Hollow Creek for 17 years, ever since the sanctuary opened to the public in 2002. He knew every trail, every hidden grove, every seasonal pattern of the native wildlife. He understood the rhythms of this place better than most people understood their own homes. But as he stood beside his maintenance truck in the empty parking lot, breathing air that tasted faintly of copper and ozone, he realized he had never experienced anything like this oppressive quiet. The sanctuary had been Dr. Sarah Whitmore's life work. At 34, she was one of the youngest sanctuary directors in the state, with a PhD in conservation biology from UC Berkeley and a passion for protecting endangered species that bordered on obsession. She had transformed Hollow Creek from a struggling nature preserve into a nationally recognized research facility, attracting scientists from around the world to study its unique ecosystem. The sanctuary was home to several endangered species, including a small population of Pacific fishes and the rare Hollow Creek salamander, found nowhere else on Earth. Dr. Whitmore lived on the property in a modest cabin near the research station, surrounded by her life's work. She rarely left the sanctuary grounds, often working 18-hour days, monitoring wildlife populations, coordinating research projects, and leading educational programs for visitors. Her dedication was legendary among conservation circles, though some colleagues worried she was becoming too isolated, too consumed by her mission to protect the creatures under her care. Marcus had last seen Dr. Whitmore 3 days earlier, on October 12th, when she had stopped by the maintenance shed to discuss repairs needed on the boardwalk that crossed the sanctuary's central wetlands. She'd seemed distracted, more so than usual, mentioning that she was concerned about unusual readings from the automated wildlife monitoring cameras scattered throughout the preserve. The cameras, part of a sophisticated tracking system that monitored animal movements and population health, had been recording strange patterns over the previous week. Animals that should have been active were remaining hidden, while others were appearing in locations where they had never been documented before. "Something's disrupting the natural patterns," she had told Marcus, her brow furrowed with concern. "The elk haven't been to their usual watering spots in 4 days. The bird populations are shifting in ways that don't match any seasonal migration patterns I've studied. And the cameras near the old growth section are picking up movement at night. But when I review the footage, there's nothing there." Marcus had suggested that perhaps the equipment was malfunctioning, but Dr. Whitmore shook her head. "I've run diagnostics on every camera. The hardware is functioning perfectly." That had been their last conversation. Now, as Marcus walked toward the visitor center to begin his morning routine, he noticed the first concrete sign that something was amiss. Dr. Whitmore's Subaru Outback was parked in its usual spot beside the research station, but her office lights were off. In all his years at the sanctuary, Marcus had never arrived to find her office dark. She was always there before him, usually by 5:30 in the morning, already deep into her work reviewing the previous night's data from the monitoring systems. The visitor center was locked, which was normal, but when Marcus used his key to enter, he immediately noticed that the coffee maker in the break room was cold. Dr. Whitmore always had coffee brewing by 6 a.m., a ritual as dependable as sunrise. The absence of that familiar aroma sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the October morning. Marcus walked through the center, checking each room methodically. Everything appeared normal. Displays about local wildlife were undisturbed, educational materials were neatly arranged, and the gift shop inventory was exactly as it should be. But the building felt hollow, as if it were waiting for something or someone who would never arrive. Outside, Marcus followed the gravel path toward Dr. Whitmore's cabin, his footsteps unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. The cabin was a simple structure, built from local timber and designed to blend seamlessly with the surrounding forest. Solar panels on the roof powered the modest home, and a small garden beside the front porch grew vegetables that Dr. Whitmore tended with the same meticulous care she applied to her conservation work. The front door was unlocked, which immediately raised Marcus's alarm. Dr. Whitmore was security conscious, always locking her door even when she was just stepping out briefly to check on nearby research equipment. Marcus called out as he pushed the door open, his voice echoing strangely in the empty rooms. "Dr. Whitmore? Sarah?" No response. Marcus stepped inside, noting that everything appeared to be in order. Dr. Whitmore's laptop was closed on the kitchen table, next to a half-empty cup of tea that had long since grown cold. A book about wildlife tracking lay open beside it, a pencil marking her place in a chapter about nocturnal behavior patterns. Her reading glasses were folded neatly on top of the book, as if she had just stepped away for a moment and planned to return. In the small living room, Marcus found more signs of an interrupted evening. A fire had burned down to cold ashes in the stone fireplace. A woolen blanket was draped over the back of the couch, and a documentary about wolves was paused on the television screen. The remote control lay on the coffee table beside a notebook filled with Dr. Whitmore's precise handwriting, documenting observations about animal behavior that Marcus couldn't fully understand. The bedroom showed no signs of disturbance. The bed was made with military precision, clothes were hung neatly in the closet, and personal items were arranged with the same methodical organization that characterized everything about Dr. Whitmore's life. Her hiking boots were missing from their usual spot by the front door, along with her field jacket and the canvas messenger bag she used to carry research equipment. Marcus called the sheriff's department from the landline in Dr. Whitmore's kitchen, his hands shaking slightly as he dialed. The dispatcher, a woman named Linda, whom Marcus had known for years, took his report with a professional calm, but he could hear the concern in her voice when he explained the situation. "I'll send Deputy Harrison out right away," Linda assured him. "In the meantime, Marcus, don't touch anything else." If Deputy Tom Harrison arrived within 30 minutes, his patrol car crunching over the gravel access road that led to the sanctuary's main buildings. Harrison was in his early 40s, a competent officer who had handled missing person cases before, though nothing quite like this. The sanctuary's remote location and the unusual circumstances of Dr. Whitmore's disappearance presented unique challenges. Harrison conducted a preliminary search of the cabin and surrounding area, taking photographs and making notes in his official report. Like Marcus, he was struck by the sense that Dr. Whitmore had simply vanished in the middle of an ordinary evening, leaving behind all the normal signs of a life in progress, but no clues about where she might have gone or why. Harrison asked as they stood in the cabin's living room, the paused documentary casting an eerie blue glow across the walls. "3 days ago," Marcus replied. "She seemed worried about something, said the animals were behaving strangely." Harrison made a note. "Sometimes, but usually she'd tell me about it." They walked to the research station, a modern building that housed Dr. Whitmore's office, laboratory equipment, and the computer systems that monitored the sanctuary's extensive network of wildlife cameras. The building was secured with an electronic lock that required Dr. Whitmore's keycard to open. Marcus didn't have access, but Harrison was able to contact the sanctuary's board of directors to obtain the override code. Inside the research station, they found Dr. Whitmore's office exactly as she had left it. Multiple computer monitors displayed live feeds from cameras throughout the sanctuary, showing empty trails and quiet forest scenes. File cabinets were locked, but her desk showed signs of recent work. A detailed map of the sanctuary was spread across the surface, marked with coloured pins and handwritten notes that seemed to track animal movements over the past several weeks. Harrison studied the map carefully. Marcus leaned over the desk, trying to interpret Dr. Whitmore's notation system. The red pins are unusual sightings, animals appearing in places they shouldn't be. The blue ones are normal patterns, but look how few there are compared to the red ones. He paused, studying a cluster of black markers in the northwest section of the map, an area of old growth forest that was rarely visited by researchers or the public. Harrison prompted, "I don't know." The black pins were concentrated in an area of the sanctuary that Marcus knew well, a section of pristine forest that had never been logged. Ancient Douglas firs towered over an understory of ferns and moss-covered fallen logs, creating a cathedral-like atmosphere that many visitors found both beautiful and slightly unsettling. The area was accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through dense vegetation for nearly 2 miles from the main visitor area. Harrison made copies of the map and photographed everything in the office before expanding the search to include the rest of the sanctuary grounds. They checked the major trails, the observation blinds used by researchers, and the small outbuildings scattered throughout the preserve. As the day wore on, they were joined by additional officers and volunteers from the local search and rescue team. The search revealed more puzzling details. Dr. Whitmore's field equipment was missing from its usual storage location, suggesting she had gone out for research purposes. But her emergency radio, which she always carried during solo fieldwork, was found in her truck, still turned off. Her cell phone was discovered in the visitor center, plugged into its charger on her desk. For someone as safety-conscious as Dr. Whitmore, venturing into the wilderness without communication devices was completely out of character. More disturbing were the findings from the wildlife monitoring system. When technicians reviewed the data from the automated cameras, they discovered that most of the devices had stopped recording 3 nights earlier, on October 12th, at approximately 11:47 p.m. The cameras hadn't malfunctioned. They had simply stopped detecting motion, as if every living creature in the sanctuary had simultaneously frozen in place or disappeared entirely. The few cameras that continued recording showed empty trails and vacant clearings where animals should have been active. But in several clips, barely visible in the infrared imaging, there were shapes that didn't correspond to any known wildlife. The forms were too large to be the sanctuary's native species, too strangely proportioned to be human, and they moved in ways that defied easy explanation. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a colleague of Dr. Whitmore's from the State University, arrived that evening to assist with the investigation. She had worked with Sarah on several research projects and knew the sanctuary's wildlife populations as well as anyone. When she reviewed the camera footage, her expression grew increasingly troubled. "This doesn't make sense," Dr. Walsh said, pausing a video clip that showed the edge of a forest clearing. "Look at this timestamp. This was taken at 2:30 a.m. on October 13th, but there's absolutely no animal activity. During optimal foraging hours, we should be seeing deer, elk, possibly bears preparing for winter, but there's nothing." She advanced the footage frame by frame, pointing to subtle changes in the shadows at the edge of the clearing. "And these shapes here, they're not consistent with any species we've documented." By the end of the first day, the official search had covered approximately 40% of the sanctuary's accessible areas. No trace of Dr. Whitmore had been found, and the mystery of her disappearance was deepening rather than resolving. The combination of her missing equipment, the strange animal behavior, and the inexplicable camera footage created a puzzle that traditional search and rescue methods seemed inadequate to solve. Sheriff Robert Kowalski arrived that evening to personally oversee the investigation. A veteran law enforcement officer with 30 years of experience, Kowalski had handled his share of missing person cases, but the circumstances surrounding Dr. Whitmore's disappearance were unlike anything in his career. "I've seen people vanish into the wilderness before," Kowalski told the assembled search team as they gathered in the visitor center for an evening briefing. "Usually there's a logical explanation: equipment failure, medical emergency, accident in difficult terrain." He gestured toward the map of the sanctuary, now marked with coloured lines indicating areas that had been searched. Dr. Whitmore was an experienced outdoorswoman who knew this land better than anyone. She had proper equipment, established safety protocols, and no apparent reason to deviate from her normal procedure. The search would continue the next day, with additional resources including K9 units and a helicopter equipped with thermal imaging cameras. But as the first day of the investigation concluded, everyone involved sensed they were dealing with something far more complex than a simple missing person case. That night, Marcus Chen volunteered to stay at the sanctuary to monitor the research station and provide local knowledge to the search teams. As he settled into Dr. Whitmore's office, surrounded by her life's work and the ever-present hum of the monitoring equipment, he found himself studying the map she had left behind. The cluster of black pins in the old growth section seemed to draw his attention repeatedly. According to the map's legend, which he finally located in Dr. The notes associated with those pins were brief but troubling. Large bipedal tracks, no match to known regional fauna. Vegetation disturbance patterns inconsistent with documented species. At 11:47 p.m., exactly 24 hours after the cameras had stopped recording, Marcus was reviewing the footage from the previous night when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the feed from camera number 23, positioned at the edge of the old growth section, there was a brief moment where something large and dark passed in front of the lens. The shape was there for less than 2 seconds, but it was clearly visible against the pale infrared background of the forest. The figure was tall, at least 7 feet in height, and moved with a strange, flowing gait that seemed almost liquid. Its proportions were wrong for a human being, with arms that appeared too long and a torso that was somehow both massive and impossibly thin. Most disturbing of all, as it passed in front of the camera, the figure seemed to turn its head directly toward the lens, as if it knew it was being watched. Marcus replayed the footage dozens of times, trying to convince himself that he was seeing shadows, a trick of the infrared imaging, or perhaps a bear rearing up on its hind legs. But the more he studied the clip, the more certain he became that he was looking at something that shouldn't exist, something that had no place in the carefully catalogued ecosystem of Hollow Creek Sanctuary. At 12:15 a.m., all the cameras went dark simultaneously, just as they had the night before. But this time, Marcus was watching in real time. But Marcus knew it wasn't equipment malfunction. In the final seconds before the feeds cut out, he had seen shapes moving through the forest, dark forms that seemed to flow between the trees like living shadows. They were heading toward the old growth section, toward the area marked with black pins on Dr. Whitmore's map, toward whatever secrets lay hidden in the heart of Hollow Creek Sanctuary. As Marcus sat alone in the research station, surrounded by dark monitors and the oppressive silence of the sanctuary at night, he realized that Dr. Sarah Whitmore hadn't simply disappeared. She had discovered something in those ancient woods, something that the scientific community wasn't prepared to acknowledge or understand. And now, whatever she had found was aware that others were looking for it. The search for Dr. Whitmore would continue, but Marcus suspected they were no longer looking for a missing person. They were looking for answers to questions that most people weren't ready to ask, in a place where boundaries between the known and unknown had become dangerously thin. Outside the research station, the forest waited in absolute silence, keeping its secrets hidden beneath a canopy of ancient trees that had witnessed things no human was meant to see. The damp morning air clung to Marcus Chen's jacket as he approached the main office of Hollow Creek Sanctuary, his boots crunching on fallen leaves that seemed too brittle for October. Something felt different about this place today. The usual chorus of rehabilitating wildlife that greeted him each morning had been replaced by an unsettling silence that made his skin crawl. No birds calling from the aviaries, no rustling from the mammal enclosures. Even the wind seemed muted, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Marcus had been the sanctuary's groundskeeper for 3 years, arriving each dawn to tend to the 140 acres of protected wetlands and forest that Dr. Sarah Whitmore had dedicated her life to preserving. Sarah should have been here already. Her battered pickup truck was always parked beside the office by 6:30, coffee brewing, radio playing softly while she reviewed the day's rehabilitation schedules. But the parking area was empty except for his own vehicle, and the office windows stared back at him like dead eyes. He knocked on the office door, the sound echoing strangely in the still air. No response. Marcus tried the handle and found it unlocked, which immediately set off alarm bells in his mind. Sarah was meticulous about security, especially after the recent incidents with poachers in the area. The door swung open to reveal an office that looked like it had been abandoned mid-task. Sarah's coffee mug sat half full on her desk, steam long since dissipated. Her computer was still on, cursor blinking, in the middle of an unfinished email. Her jacket hung on the back of her chair, as if she had just stepped out for a moment. But it was the papers scattered across her desk that made Marcus's blood run cold. Maps of the sanctuary with areas circled in red ink. Photographs of disturbed ground and broken branches. Handwritten notes in Sarah's careful script describing strange animal behavior and unexplained sounds in the old growth forest. At the center of it all lay her field notebook, open to an entry dated the previous evening that made his hands shake as he read it. "The animals know something we don't," she had written. Third night, in a row of complete silence after sunset. Found deer. Remains this morning arranged in patterns that don't match any known predator behavior. Trail cameras keep malfunctioning in Sector 7. Whatever is happening in the deep woods, it's getting closer to the main compound. I need to investigate tonight. If something happens to me, check the hidden files on my computer. Password is Sanctuary 2019. The truth needs to come out. Marcus stared at the notebook for a long moment, processing what he was reading. Sarah had been acting strangely for weeks, staying late, making cryptic comments about protecting the sanctuary from threats that weren't poachers or developers. He had assumed she was just stressed about funding issues or regulatory problems. Now he realized she had been investigating something far more serious. With trembling fingers, he accessed Sarah's computer using the password from her notebook. The hidden files contained dozens of documents that painted a picture of escalating strangeness at Hollow Creek. Motion sensor data showing large objects moving through the forest at impossible speeds. Audio recordings of sounds that didn't match any known wildlife. Correspondence with other wildlife biologists describing similar phenomena at remote preserves across the region. Most disturbing were the photographs. Images captured by trail cameras before they mysteriously stopped working showed shadowy figures moving between the trees. Tall, impossibly thin shapes that seemed to phase in and out of visibility. In one particularly clear image, something that might have been a face stared directly into the camera lens. The features were almost human but wrong in ways that made Marcus's vision blur when he tried to focus on the details. Sarah's research notes indicated she had been documenting these incidents for months, trying to find rational explanations for increasingly irrational events. She had consulted with colleagues, reached out to researchers studying similar phenomena, even contacted federal wildlife agencies. But the responses had been dismissive or evasive, suggesting either incompetence or deliberate suppression of information. The final entry in her digital journal was timestamped at 11:47 the previous night. Temperature dropping rapidly in Sector 7 despite clear weather forecast. Animals completely silent within half-mile radius of old growth area. Motion sensors detecting movement, but cameras show nothing. Going to investigate on foot. Have left detailed maps with Marcus's contact information in case of emergency. Whatever is happening here is not natural, and it's accelerating. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October morning. Sarah had gone into the woods alone last night to confront something that had been terrorizing the local wildlife for months. something that could disable electronic equipment and move through the forest without appearing on camera. Something that had now, apparently, taken her. He grabbed the maps from Sarah's desk and studied the areas she had marked with increasing alarm. The red circles formed a pattern that seemed to spiral inward toward the heart of the old-growth forest. An area that had always felt different from the rest of the sanctuary. Even on the brightest days, the canopy there was so thick that the ground remained in perpetual twilight. The trees were older and larger than anywhere else on the property, some dating back centuries before the first European settlers arrived. Sarah's notes indicated that the disturbances had started small, animals avoiding certain areas, plants dying in geometric patterns, water sources becoming contaminated with substances that couldn't be identified. But over the past month, the phenomena had intensified dramatically. Entire species had begun abandoning their territories within the sanctuary. The few animals that remained exhibited signs of extreme stress, cowering in their enclosures and refusing to venture outside, even for food. Marcus tried calling Sarah's cell phone, knowing it was futile but needing to try. The call went straight to voicemail, her familiar voice cheerfully asking him to leave a message. He tried the satellite phone she kept for emergencies in remote areas of the sanctuary. No response. He contacted the local sheriff's department, but they seemed reluctant to launch a search operation based solely on a missing person report filed after just one night. The deputy who took his control was polite but dismissive. "Dr. Whitmore is known for her dedication to her work," the man said. "She's probably just camping out in the woods doing research. Give it another day or two before you start panicking. Besides, those old growth areas can be tricky to navigate. She might be fine but just can't get back to her phone." But Marcus knew Sarah better than that. She was responsible to a fault, always checking in, always following safety protocols. If she had planned to stay overnight in the woods, she would have informed him and left detailed instructions for caring for the animals. Her absence, combined with the evidence of her investigation into increasingly dangerous phenomena, painted a much darker picture. Against his better judgment, Marcus decided to follow Sarah's trail into the old growth forest. He equipped himself with everything he could think of that might be useful. Flashlights, extra batteries, first aid supplies, emergency flares, rope, and a GPS device. He left detailed notes about his planned route and estimated return time, following Sarah's own safety protocols, even as he prepared to violate them by going alone. The trail into Sector 7 started normally enough. Well-maintained paths that Sarah had walked hundreds of times during her years managing the sanctuary. But as Marcus penetrated deeper into the woods, the environment began to change in subtle ways that made him increasingly uneasy. The air grew colder despite the mild autumn weather. The normal sounds of forest life, birds calling, insects buzzing, small animals rustling through undergrowth gradually faded until he was walking in complete silence. Most unsettling was the quality of the light. Even though it was mid-morning on a clear day, the deeper he went into the old growth area, the dimmer his surroundings became. Not the natural dimness of a thick canopy, but something more oppressive. The shadows seemed to move independently of their sources, shifting and writhing in ways that made his eyes water when he tried to track them. Marcus found the first sign of Sarah's passage about 2 miles into the forest. Her field notebook lay open beside the trail, pages fluttering in a breeze he couldn't feel. The final entry was written in handwriting that grew increasingly erratic as it progressed. "The silence here is absolute," she had written. "No insects, no birds, no wind through the leaves. It's like the forest is holding its breath. The trees themselves seem to be watching me. I can feel something massive moving just beyond the edge of vision. I think I understand now why the animals have been fleeing. This isn't a natural phenomenon. This is something that doesn't belong in our world." Beyond the notebook, Marcus found signs of a struggle. Disturbed ground, broken branches, Sarah's equipment scattered across a small clearing. Her backpack hung from a tree branch 15 feet off the ground, as if it had been thrown there with tremendous force. Her GPS device lay smashed on the forest floor, its screen cracked and dark. But there was no sign of Sarah herself, no indication of which direction she might have gone or been taken. The silence in the clearing was so complete that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. When he tried to use his radio to call for help, he discovered that it produced only static. His cell phone showed no signal, despite being in an area where coverage was normally excellent. Even his GPS device seemed confused, displaying coordinates that couldn't be correct, and showing his location as several miles from where he knew he was standing. As Marcus searched the clearing for additional clues, he became aware of a presence watching him from the shadows between the trees. Not seeing anything directly, but sensing something large and patient observing his every move. When he turned to look, the shadow seemed to shift and thicken, creating the impression of movement without revealing its source. The feeling of being watched intensified until his skin crawled with the certainty that he was no longer alone in the forest. That's when he found Sarah's final message. Carved into the bark of an ancient oak tree with what must have been tremendous effort were words that made his blood freeze. They're not from here. They've been waiting. The sanctuary was never about protecting wildlife. It was about containing something that should never have been disturbed. If you're reading this, don't try to find me. Warn the authorities. Evacuate the area. Some doors should never be opened. Below the carved message, scratched into the dirt at the base of the tree, were symbols that hurt to look at directly. Geometric patterns that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed peripherally. Marcus tried to photograph them with his phone, but the images came out as blurred smears of darkness, as if the camera couldn't properly focus on whatever it was recording. The presence watching him from the shadows seemed to grow stronger and more focused as he examined Sarah's final message. Marcus could feel something massive moving through the forest around him, circling his position with predatory patience. The air itself seemed to thicken and press against him, making it difficult to breathe. When he tried to retreat toward the trail, he discovered that the path he had followed into the clearing was no longer visible. The forest around him had somehow rearranged itself, presenting only an impenetrable wall of ancient trees and shifting shadows. In that moment of growing panic, Marcus realized that Sarah's investigation had uncovered something far more dangerous than unusual animal behavior or environmental anomalies. The Hollow Creek Sanctuary had been built on something ancient and malevolent, something that had been contained for decades but was now stirring to life. Sarah's disappearance wasn't just a missing person case. It was the first casualty in an awakening that threatened to consume everything in its path. The shadows between the trees began to coalesce into shapes that defied rational comprehension. Tall figures that moved with fluid grace, despite their impossible proportions. Eyes that reflected light from sources that weren't there. Voices that whispered in languages that predated human speech. Marcus understood with crystal clarity that he was witnessing something that no human was meant to see. Something that existed in the spaces between reality and nightmare. As the figures emerged more clearly from their concealment, Marcus caught his first full glimpse of what had taken Sarah Whitmore. Creatures were humanoid, but wrong in every detail. Too tall, too thin, with joints that bent in directions that violated anatomy. Their faces were almost human, but stretched and distorted as if viewed through water. When they moved, they seemed to phase in and out of visible reality, appearing solid one moment and translucent the next. But it was their eyes that held Marcus frozen in place. Ancient, intelligent, and utterly alien. Eyes that looked at him not as a threat or prey, but as something insignificant that had stumbled into affairs beyond its comprehension. In those eyes, Marcus saw the truth that Sarah had discovered in her final moments. These beings had been here long before humans arrived, sleeping beneath the old growth forest, waiting for the right conditions to emerge from their ancient slumber. The sanctuary hadn't been established to protect wildlife. It had been created as a containment zone, using the cover of environmental conservation to monitor and suppress something that government agencies knew existed but couldn't explain. Sarah's research into unusual phenomena had been part of a larger pattern of scientific investigation designed to understand and control forces that operated outside conventional reality. But something had changed recently. The containment was failing. The barriers that had kept these entities dormant for decades were weakening, allowing them to influence the physical world with increasing strength. The strange animal behavior, the equipment failures, the environmental anomalies, all of it had been the beginning of a larger emergence that would soon extend far beyond the boundaries of the sanctuary. Marcus understood that he was witnessing the opening stages of something that would reshape everything humanity thought it knew about the world. The rational, ordered reality that people took for granted was just a thin veneer over deeper truths that most minds couldn't process without breaking. Sarah had gotten too close to those truths, and now she was gone, absorbed into a reality that existed parallel to, but separate from normal human experience. The last thing Marcus remembered before losing consciousness was the sound of Sarah's voice calling to him from somewhere beyond the visible forest. Not crying for help or expressing fear, but speaking with calm certainty about the beauty and terror of what she had discovered. Her words echoed from impossible distances, describing vistas and experiences that had no equivalent in human language. She was still alive, in some sense, but existing in a state that transcended normal definitions of life and death. When rescue teams finally found Marcus 3 days later, he was discovered sitting calmly at the base of the carved oak tree, staring into the shadows with an expression of profound understanding. He was physically unharmed, but fundamentally changed, speaking in whispers about revelations that the search teams couldn't comprehend. His descriptions of Sarah's fate and the true nature of the Hollow Creek Sanctuary were dismissed as trauma-induced hallucinations, symptoms of exposure and dehydration rather than genuine encounters with otherworldly forces. But the officials who debriefed Marcus after his rescue knew better. They recognized the signs from previous incidents at other containment sites around the world. Marcus had seen too much, learned too much, come too close to truths that threatened the carefully maintained illusion of normal reality. Like Sarah before him, he had crossed a threshold from which there was no complete return. The Hollow Creek Sanctuary was quietly shut down within a week of Sarah's disappearance. The official explanation cited budget cuts and environmental concerns. But the real reason was the recognition that containment had failed catastrophically. The area was designated as a restricted wildlife preserve, accessible only to personnel with the highest security clearances. The ancient forest was left to itself, its secrets buried under layers of bureaucratic classification and deliberate ignorance. But those who knew the truth understood that closing the sanctuary hadn't solved the problem. It had merely acknowledged that some forces were beyond human control or comprehension. Whatever had awakened in those ancient woods was still there, growing stronger, preparing for a larger emergence that would eventually extend far beyond the boundaries of any containment zone. Sarah Whitmore's disappearance had been just the beginning of something that would challenge everything humanity believed about the nature of reality itself. The silence that had descended over Hollow Creek on that October morning was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something so vast and alien that even nature itself held its breath in recognition of powers that predated all earthly life. The sanctuary fell silent as Marcus Chen stepped through the doorway, his flashlight beam cutting through the unnatural darkness that had settled over Hollow Creek. Behind him, the search team's footsteps echoed against the walls, but ahead lay something that would challenge everything they thought they understood about Dr. Sarah Whitmore's disappearance and the true nature of the sanctuary itself. The trail of evidence had led them deeper into the old-growth forest, where the very air seemed to thicken with an oppressive weight that made breathing difficult. Marcus had spent 3 sleepless nights poring over Whitmore's hidden files, cross-referencing her cryptic notes with geological surveys, historical records, and incident reports dating back decades. What emerged was a picture so disturbing that even now, standing at the threshold of discovery, his mind struggled to accept it. The Hollow Creek Sanctuary had been built on land that carried whispers of strangeness long before the first conservation efforts began. Native tribes had avoided this particular stretch of forest for generations, speaking in hushed tones of a place where the earth itself was hungry, where trees grew in patterns that hurt the eyes to follow, and where animals would venture in but never emerge. Early settlers had reported similar phenomena, livestock disappearing without trace, compasses spinning wildly, and an overwhelming sense of being watched by something vast and patient. Dr. Whitmore's research had uncovered references in county records to a series of unexplained incidents spanning over a century. In 1887, a surveying team had vanished while mapping the area, leaving behind only their equipment arranged in a perfect spiral pattern around a clearing that shouldn't have existed. In 1923, a lumber company had abandoned their operation after workers reported that freshly cut trees would be found standing upright again the following morning, their stumps somehow healed. In 1956, a geological expedition had filed reports describing rock formations that defied conventional understanding, stones that seemed to shift when observed directly, and cave systems that led far deeper into the earth than any natural formation should allow. Marcus had initially dismissed these accounts as folklore and exaggeration, the kind of local legends that accumulate around any isolated wilderness area. But Whitmore's files contained something that changed his perspective entirely. She had discovered that the sanctuary's location hadn't been chosen randomly by well-meaning conservationists. The land had been specifically selected and purchased by a coalition of wealthy benefactors who understood exactly what lay beneath the surface. The Hollow Creek Sanctuary wasn't meant to protect the forest. It was meant to contain what lived within it. The financial records were deliberately obscured, hidden behind layers of shell companies and charitable trusts. But Whitmore had painstakingly traced the funding back to its sources. The money came from families whose names appeared in the strangest places throughout American history. Industrial dynasties that had built their fortunes during periods of unexplained prosperity, always followed by whispers of unusual practices and secretive rituals. Banking empires that had weathered every economic crisis with supernatural resilience. Political families whose influence seemed to extend far beyond what their public profiles should have allowed. These weren't ordinary wealthy philanthropists concerned about environmental protection. They were the descendants of people who had made contact with something ancient and alien, something that offered power and knowledge in exchange for very specific forms of service. The sanctuary was their way of maintaining that relationship while keeping it hidden from a world that wasn't ready to understand the true nature of reality. Dr. Whitmore's disappearance hadn't been random. She had gotten too close to the truth, and the entities that dwelt in the deep places beneath Hollow Creek had taken notice. Her investigation into the electromagnetic anomalies had led her to discover that the disturbances weren't caused by natural geological processes. They were signals, a form of communication between the surface world and something that existed in dimensions parallel to our own. The geometric patterns that had been appearing throughout the forest weren't crop circles or artistic installations. They were focal points, places where the barrier between realities had been deliberately weakened. The missing animals hadn't been killed or relocated. They had been transformed. Their consciousness absorbed into a collective intelligence that was slowly awakening after centuries of dormancy. Marcus felt his hands trembling as he followed the search team deeper into the sanctuary's heart. The flashlight beams revealed trees that grew in impossible spirals, their bark covered with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed directly. The ground beneath their feet felt spongy and warm, as if they were walking across living tissue rather than earth and fallen leaves. The air itself had taken on a quality that made their voices sound muffled and distant, even when speaking directly to each other. They had been walking for what felt like hours when they reached the clearing. It was perfectly circular, perhaps 50 feet in diameter, surrounded by trees that leaned inward at angles that should have caused them to fall. At the center stood a structure that hadn't been there in any of the aerial photographs or satellite images Marcus had studied. It appeared to be made of the same dark stone as the geometric patterns, but it rose from the earth like a natural formation, as if it had grown rather than been built. The structure was roughly pyramidal in shape, but its surfaces were covered with the same shifting symbols they had seen on the trees. As they approached, Marcus realized that the symbols weren't carved into the stone. They were part of it, patterns of darkness and light that moved beneath the surface like living things swimming in black water. The effect was hypnotic and deeply unsettling, creating an optical illusion that made it difficult to judge distances or maintain balance. At the base of the structure, they found Dr. Whitmore's equipment. Her cameras, recording devices, and measurement instruments were arranged in a careful circle around what appeared to be an entrance. The opening was perfectly smooth, descending into the earth at an angle that suggested a complex network of passages beneath the forest floor. But what captured Marcus's attention wasn't the equipment or the entrance itself. It was the condition of the recording devices. Every camera contained footage that shouldn't have been possible. The timestamps showed continuous recording over the past week, but the images defied explanation. They showed the forest changing, trees moving and reshaping themselves, the very landscape flowing like liquid. They showed figures moving through the darkness, tall and impossibly thin, with limbs that bent in ways that hurt to observe. Most disturbing of all, they showed Dr. Whitmore herself, but not as she had been when she disappeared. In the footage, Whitmore moved with a strange, gliding motion, her body elongated and pale, her eyes reflecting light like those of a nocturnal animal. She appeared to be communicating with the entities, gesturing toward the sky and then pointing deeper into the forest. Her mouth moved as if she was speaking, but when Marcus turned up the audio, all he could hear was a sound like wind through underground caverns, punctuated by harmonics that made his teeth ache. The final piece of footage showed Whitmore descending into the structure's entrance, but she wasn't alone. She was accompanied by 3 of the elongated figures, and as they moved deeper into the passage, the camera began to malfunction. The image became increasingly distorted, showing flashes of impossible geometries and spaces that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the human eye could process. The last clear frame showed Whitmore turning back toward the camera, her face serene but utterly changed, her features somehow more angular and alien than human. Marcus knew they should retreat, should call for backup, should report their findings to authorities better equipped to handle whatever they had discovered. But something about the structure compelled him forward. Perhaps it was professional curiosity, or perhaps the entities below were already exerting their influence, drawing him deeper into their domain. Either way, he found himself stepping toward the entrance, his flashlight beam probing the smooth-walled passage that descended into the earth. The passage was wider than it had appeared from the surface, easily accommodating the search team as they moved single file into the depths. The walls were covered with the same flowing symbols they had seen above, but here they pulsed with a faint bioluminescence that made their flashlights seem almost redundant. The air grew warmer as they descended, carrying scents that reminded Marcus of deep ocean trenches and underground rivers, places where sunlight had never penetrated. After what felt like an eternity of descent, the passage opened into a vast underground chamber. Their flashlight beams couldn't reach the far walls or ceiling, creating the impression of standing in an infinite space carved from living rock. But as their eyes adjusted to the strange, shifting light emanating from the walls, they began to make out structures within the chamber that challenged their understanding of both architecture and physics. The chamber contained what could only be described as a city, but one designed for inhabitants whose needs and perceptions were utterly alien to human experience. Buildings rose and twisted in patterns that seemed to follow mathematical principles beyond terrestrial geometry. Bridges connected structures at impossible angles, creating a three-dimensional maze that hurt to contemplate. And moving through this impossible architecture were the entities themselves, dozens of them. Their elongated forms gliding through the air as easily as walking across solid ground. At the center of the chamber stood the largest structure, a temple or palace of sorts that seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm. And there, standing at its base, was Dr. Sarah Whitmore. But the woman Marcus had known for years was gone, replaced by something that wore her form but moved with alien grace. When she turned towards them, her eyes reflected the chamber's phosphorescent glow, and when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that resonated in their bones. She welcomed them to the true Hollow Creek Sanctuary, explaining that everything they had believed about the preserve was merely the surface layer of a much deeper reality. The entities had been waiting patiently for humanity to evolve enough to understand their message, and Dr. Whitmore had been chosen to serve as an ambassador between the two species. The sanctuary above was just a testing ground, a place where they could observe human behavior and gradually introduce concepts that would prepare the world for a larger revelation. The electromagnetic anomalies weren't side effects of the entity's presence. They were intentional signals being broadcast across the planet, preparing other sites for similar awakenings. The missing animals had been transformed into hybrid creatures that could serve as intermediaries between human and alien consciousness. The geometric patterns were landing beacons, marking locations where the barriers between dimensions were thin enough to allow for easier passage. As Dr. Whitmore spoke, Marcus realized that everything they had discovered above ground was merely the beginning. The entities beneath Hollow Creek were part of a vast network spanning the globe. Ancient intelligences that had been subtly influencing human development for millennia. They had guided the construction of certain architectural monuments, inspired particular scientific discoveries, and even influenced the evolution of human consciousness itself. Now they were ready to make themselves known more directly, and they needed human collaborators to help ease the transition. The search team found themselves faced with an impossible choice. They could attempt to flee, carrying knowledge that would likely be dismissed as madness by the outside world. They could try to resist, though the entity's power was clearly beyond anything human technology could challenge. Or they could accept the invitation being offered, allowing themselves to be transformed as Dr. Whitmore had been, becoming bridges between humanity and something vast and alien that had been waiting in the darkness for far longer than human civilization had existed. As Marcus stood in that impossible underground city, surrounded by beings whose very existence challenged everything he thought he knew about reality, he understood that the disappearance at Hollow Creek Sanctuary was just the first chapter in a story that would reshape humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. The question was whether that reshaping would represent transcendence or extinction, and whether anyone would ever know the difference. The choice, like the entities themselves, waited patiently in the darkness beneath the earth, where time moved differently and the rules that govern the surface world held no power. Marcus Chen had been searching for Dr. Sarah Whitmore for 3 days when he found the first body. The groundskeeper at Hollow Creek Sanctuary had worked these trails for 7 years, knew every tree, every shadow that fell across the forest floor during the changing seasons. But as October gave way to November, something fundamental had shifted in the sanctuary's atmosphere. The animals moved differently now, clustering in groups, avoiding certain areas entirely. The electromagnetic readings that Dr. Whitmore had been tracking showed wild fluctuations that defied explanation. And now, with the sanctuary's director missing, and no trace of where she might have gone, Marcus faced a discovery that would force him to confront the terrible truth about what they had been containing all along. The body lay in a clearing he had walked through countless times before, positioned as if it had been carefully placed rather than fallen. But this wasn't Dr. Whitmore. This was something else entirely. Something that had once been human, but bore the unmistakable signs of transformation that Marcus had seen in the sanctuary's surveillance footage during those final days before the director disappeared. The creature's limbs were elongated, stretched beyond human proportions, with joints that bent in direction that violated basic anatomy. Its skin had taken on a translucent quality, revealing a network of dark veins that pulsed with a faint rhythmic light. The face, while retaining some human features, showed the same distortions that Dr. Whitmore had documented in her research notes. Eyes that were too large, positioned at angles that suggested depth perception adapted for different dimensional perspectives. A mouth that extended too far back into the skull, filled with teeth that seemed designed for purposes beyond mere consumption. But what disturbed Marcus most was the expression frozen on the creature's face. Not the agony or terror one might expect from such a dramatic transformation, but something that looked almost like ecstasy, as if the metamorphosis had been welcomed rather than endured. Marcus knelt beside the remains, fighting waves of nausea as he examined the evidence before him. The creature's clothing, what remained of it, bore the insignia of the sanctuary's research team. This had been Dr. Patricia Vance, the quantum physicist who had joined Dr. Whitmore's investigation just 3 weeks ago. The same Dr. Vance who had expressed concerns about the accelerating anomalies, who had recommended immediate evacuation of all non-essential personnel, who had disappeared 2 days before Dr. Whitmore's own vanishing. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. If Dr. Vance had undergone this transformation, if her disappearance was connected to whatever forces were at work within the sanctuary, then Dr. Whitmore's fate might be far worse than a simple missing person case. The director hadn't just vanished. She had been taken, or worse, she had been changed. Marcus stood slowly, his hands trembling as he reached for his radio. But before he could contact the authorities, movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. More figures were emerging from the tree line, moving with the same unnatural gait he had observed in the security footage. These weren't animals responding to some unknown stimulus. These were the sanctuary's missing researchers, transformed into something that retained enough human intelligence to be purposeful in their actions, but had been fundamentally altered in ways that challenged every assumption about the nature of life itself. Dr. James Mitchell, the sanctuary's former chief veterinarian, approached with movements that seemed to flow rather than walk. His transformation was more advanced than Dr. Vance's, his features having taken on an almost geometric quality that suggested adaptation to perceiving realities beyond human comprehension. Behind him came Dr. Lisa Park, the botanist who had first noticed the unusual growth patterns in the sanctuary's plant life. Her elongated fingers now ended in structures that looked more like sensory organs than hands, constantly moving as if sampling information from the air itself. But it was the fourth figure that made Marcus's blood freeze in his veins. Dr. Sarah Whitmore stepped into the clearing, and while her transformation was less physically dramatic than the others, the change in her bearing was unmistakable. She moved with the confidence of someone who had gained knowledge that transcended human understanding, her eyes holding depths that seemed to contain entire worlds of alien experience. "Marcus," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated at frequencies that made his bones ache. "We've been waiting for you to find us." The groundskeeper backed away, his mind reeling as he tried to process what he was seeing. "Dr. Whitmore, what happened to you?" Sarah smiled, an expression that managed to be both familiar and utterly alien. "We've been elevated, Marcus. The entities we thought we were containing weren't prisoners at all. They were teachers, waiting for minds capable of understanding their gifts. The sanctuary was never about protection from them." "The underground city," Marcus whispered, remembering the images from the surveillance footage. "The architecture isn't just physical, Marcus. It's a framework for consciousness itself. Each room, each impossible angle, each space that shouldn't exist according to human geometry, they're all designed to expand awareness beyond the limitations of terrestrial thinking." Dr. Mitchell stepped forward, his transformed features reflecting patterns of light that seemed to come from within his altered physiology. "The animals knew first. Their instincts recognized what we couldn't accept. The barriers between worlds have been thinning for decades, and this sanctuary was built on one of the primary convergence points." "The electromagnetic readings," Marcus said, pieces of the puzzle beginning to form a horrifying picture. "The strange animal behavior, the geometric patterns in the forest." Sarah nodded, her movements carrying a fluid grace that no human could naturally possess. "Not orchestrating, Marcus, facilitating. The process was always going to happen." "What about the people who depend on this sanctuary?" "They'll all be elevated in time," Dr. Park said, her voice carrying undertones that seemed to bypass Marcus's ears and speak directly to his nervous system. "The transformation isn't destruction, it's evolution." Marcus felt his hand moving toward the emergency beacon in his jacket, but found his muscles responding sluggishly, as if the very air around these transformed researchers was affecting his ability to function normally. "People will come looking for you. When Dr. "Let them come," Sarah said, her smile widening to reveal teeth that had been subtly reshaped into more efficient configurations. "The more minds that are exposed to what we've discovered, the faster the process will spread. The entities have been patient for centuries, Marcus, but their patience has limits." The groundskeeper managed to activate his beacon, sending out a distress signal that would bring help within hours. But as he looked at the faces of people he had worked with for years, people who had been dedicated to protecting and preserving life, he realized that help might not be enough. Whatever had happened to them in the depths beneath the sanctuary had changed them so fundamentally that they might not be recoverable. "The signal won't matter," Dr. Whitmore said, apparently sensing his action. "Those who come will see what we've seen, learn what we've learned. The underground city isn't bound by the physical limitations of the sanctuary's borders." As if to demonstrate her point, the clearing around them began to shift. The familiar trees and undergrowth remained, but they were now overlaid with architectural elements that belonged to no human construction. Pillars of crystalline material rose from the earth, their surfaces reflecting images of vast spaces that extended far beyond what should have been possible in this location. The geometric patterns that Dr. Whitmore had documented throughout the sanctuary were now visible as part of a larger design, a complex network of interconnected structures that transformed the forest into something that resembled a living city. "The barriers are dissolving, Marcus," Sarah continued, her voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to come from multiple sources simultaneously. "What you're seeing is the true nature of this place, the reality that's been hidden beneath the surface appearance." Marcus found himself able to move again, but the landscape around him had become so alien that he couldn't determine which direction would lead to safety. The paths he had walked for years were now interwoven with passages that led to spaces that existed outside normal geometry. The sky above showed stars in configurations that didn't match any earthly night, suggesting that the transformation extended far beyond the sanctuary's physical boundaries. He asked, his voice barely audible against the subsonic harmonics that seemed to emanate from the transformed landscape itself. "We want you to understand," Dr. Mitchell said, approaching with movements that seemed to bend space around him. The entities we encountered aren't conquerors or destroyers. They're gardeners, cultivating consciousness throughout the universe. The ancient sites, Marcus realized, remembering Dr. Whitmore's research into historical anomalies. Stonehenge, the pyramids, all the places that have been associated with unexplained phenomena. Nodes in a consciousness matrix that spans galaxies, Dr. Park confirmed. Her transformed hands weaving patterns in the air that left trails of light lingering in their wake. Human civilization has been unconsciously building toward this moment for millennia. Marcus felt his rational mind struggling to process the magnitude of what they were describing. If what they said was true, then everything he thought he knew about reality, about human history, about the nature of existence itself, was merely the surface layer of something far more complex and purposeful. He asked. Sarah's expression grew more serious, her transformed features reflecting patterns of concern that transcended human emotion. Because time is running out. The process of dimensional integration isn't just happening on Earth. It's occurring simultaneously across multiple worlds, multiple realities. Isolation, Dr. Mitchell said, his voice carrying undertones of something that might have been sadness. Cut off from the greater community of consciousness, trapped in a single dimensional layer while the universe moves on without you. The implications were staggering. Marcus found himself facing a choice that no human should have to make. Accept a transformation that would fundamentally alter everything about his existence, or risk the complete isolation of his entire species from the broader universe of intelligent life. The decision isn't just yours, Marcus, Dr. Whitmore said, apparently reading his thoughts with an accuracy that suggested her transformation had included telepathic capabilities. But your choice will influence others. The integration process works most efficiently when it spreads through networks of trust and familiarity. And if I refuse, then you'll delay the inevitable while ensuring that the eventual transformation is more traumatic and less complete, Dr. Park said. The entities are patient, but they're not infinitely so. Marcus looked around at the transformed landscape, at the faces of colleagues who had become something beyond human, at the architectural impossibilities that now defined his reality. The emergency beacon he had activated would bring help within hours, but he was beginning to understand that traditional concepts of rescue and escape no longer applied to his situation. He asked. They'll be offered the same choice you're being offered now, Sarah replied. Some will accept immediately, understanding intuitively that this represents evolution rather than destruction. Others will resist, requiring more time and patience. The children, Marcus said, thinking of the school groups that regularly visited the sanctuary. The families who come here for educational programs. They'll be protected, Dr. Mitchell assured him, his transformed features expressing something that resembled compassion. The entities have no interest in causing unnecessary suffering. Children adapt to the integration process more easily than adults. As they spoke, Marcus became aware of movement throughout the forest around them. More figures were emerging from the transformed landscape, some recognizably human in their basic form, others so altered that their original species was difficult to determine. They moved with purpose and coordination, as if guided by a collective intelligence that encompassed all of them while still allowing for individual consciousness. The sanctuary staff, Marcus realized, everyone who's been reported missing. They're all elevated, Sarah corrected, part of something larger than they could have imagined when they were trapped in purely human perspective. We're not the same people we were before, Marcus, but we're still ourselves. The sound of helicopters in the distance indicated that Marcus's distress signal had been received, and help was on the way. But as he looked at the impossible architecture that now surrounded them, at the transformed beings who had once been his colleagues, at the stars in the sky that belonged to no earthly constellation, he realized that the concepts of help and rescue had become meaningless. "The integration is accelerating," Dr. Whitmore observed, her enhanced senses apparently detecting the approaching aircraft. "Each new mind that encounters what we've become will have to make the same choice." Marcus felt the weight of decision pressing down on him. In a matter of hours, search and rescue teams would arrive, followed by investigators, scientists, and officials from various agencies. Each of them would be exposed to the same transformative forces that had changed the sanctuary's staff. The process would spread outward from this location like ripples in a pond, eventually reaching population centers where the choice between resistance and acceptance would affect millions of people. "There's something else you need to understand," Sarah said, her voice taking on tones that suggested she was about to reveal information of crucial importance. The sanctuary was never the primary site. It was just the first location where the barriers became thin enough for controlled contact. There are dozens of other sites around the world where similar processes are beginning. The integration isn't confined to this place or this moment. The helicopters were getting closer now, their engines creating vibrations that seemed to resonate with the crystalline structures emerging from the forest floor. Marcus realized that within minutes, the isolation of the sanctuary would be broken, and whatever happened next would involve far more people than just himself and the transformed research team. "Choose quickly, Marcus," Dr. Mitchell urged, his alien features expressing something that might have been urgency. "The window for conscious, willing integration is narrowing." Marcus looked up at the approaching aircraft, then back at the faces of people he had known and worked with for years. They were still recognizably themselves, but they had become something more than human, connected to realities and purposes that transcended anything he had previously imagined possible. The choice was no longer just about his own fate. It was about the future. The investigation at Hollow Creek Sanctuary had reached a critical juncture. Dr. Sarah Whitmore's discovery of the transformed entities and the interdimensional gateway beneath the research facility marked only the beginning of a far more complex situation than anyone could have anticipated. As federal authorities established their perimeter and rescue teams prepared their equipment, none of them understood they were about to encounter something that would challenge every assumption about reality itself. Agent Marcus Kane arrived at the sanctuary at 800 hours on the morning of November 15th, leading a specialized task force equipped for hazardous material containment and potential bioterrorism scenarios. His team consisted of 12 highly trained operatives, each with extensive experience in unconventional threats. As their convoy approached the main entrance, Kane noticed the unusual silence that seemed to permeate the entire area. No bird songs, no insect sounds, not even the whisper of wind through the trees that surrounded the facility. The sanctuary's main building appeared normal from the outside, its modern architecture and solar panels giving no indication of the otherworldly activities occurring beneath. However, Kane's electromagnetic field detectors immediately began registering anomalous readings that spiked dramatically as they moved closer to the structure. The air itself seemed to vibrate with an energy that made his teeth ache and caused subtle distortions in their radio communications. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the team's xenobiologist, was the first to notice the geometric patterns that had begun appearing on the building's exterior walls. These weren't painted or carved, but seemed to emerge from within the material itself, as if the very molecules of concrete and steel were rearranging themselves into configurations that hurt to look at directly. The patterns pulsed with a faint bioluminescence that registered across multiple spectrums simultaneously, creating visual effects that their cameras struggled to capture accurately. Inside the facility, the transformation had accelerated beyond what Dr. Whitmore had initially documented. The corridors now curved in ways that defied architectural logic, with surfaces that seemed to flow like liquid while maintaining their apparent solidity. The air shimmered with microscopic particles that moved in perfect synchronization, creating complex three-dimensional mandalas that hung suspended in mid-air before dissolving and reforming in new configurations. The research staff they encountered had undergone further changes since the initial reports. Their elongated limbs now moved with an alien grace, and their skin had taken on a translucent quality that revealed underlying structures that bore no resemblance to human anatomy. Most disturbing was their method of communication, which had evolved beyond the harmonic patterns previously observed. They now seemed to exchange information through direct contact, pressing their palms together and sharing knowledge instantaneously through some form of biological data transfer. Dr. Sarah Whitmore met Kane's team in what had once been the main laboratory. Her own transformation was evident but less advanced than her colleagues. She could still communicate verbally, though her voice carried harmonic undertones that seemed to resonate directly in the listener's chest cavity. Her eyes had developed an inner luminescence, and her movements possessed an uncanny precision that suggested enhanced sensory capabilities. The situation is far more complex than our initial reports indicated, Dr. Whitmore explained to Kane, her words accompanied by subtle hand gestures that seemed to carry additional layers of meaning. What we initially interpreted as an invasion or contamination is actually an invitation. The entities beneath the sanctuary aren't conquering us. They're offering us an opportunity to transcend our current limitations as a species. Kane's team documented everything they observed, but their equipment began malfunctioning in increasingly sophisticated ways. Cameras captured images that showed different scenes when reviewed later. Audio recordings contained conversations that hadn't occurred during the actual events. Most unsettling were the temporal anomalies that began manifesting around the facility. Team members would experience brief moments where they seemed to exist in multiple locations simultaneously, or recall events that hadn't yet happened. The underground chambers had expanded dramatically since Dr. Whitmore's initial exploration. What had been a single large space now opened into a vast complex that seemed to extend far beyond the physical boundaries of the sanctuary property. The walls displayed constantly shifting murals that depicted scenes from civilizations across the galaxy, showing the same transformation process occurring on hundreds of different worlds throughout cosmic history. At the center of this expanded space stood structures that defied easy description. They appeared to be grown rather than built, composed of materials that shifted between organic and crystalline states. These formations pulsed with energy patterns that Kane's sensors identified as matching the electromagnetic signatures detected by radio telescopes from distant quasars. The implications were staggering, suggesting that the sanctuary had become a communication node in a network spanning intergalactic distances. The transformed researchers moved through this environment with obvious familiarity, tending to equipment that seemed to operate on principles beyond current human understanding. They showed no signs of distress or coercion, appearing instead to work with purposeful enthusiasm on projects whose scope remained incomprehensible to the unmodified observers. Dr. Chen's biological analysis of tissue samples revealed that the transformation process was far more sophisticated than initially believed. The changes weren't random mutations, but precisely orchestrated modifications that enhanced cognitive capacity, sensory acuity, and biological efficiency. The transformed individuals showed increased brain activity in regions associated with pattern recognition and spatial reasoning, while simultaneously developing new neural structures that had no equivalent in baseline human anatomy. Most significantly, the modifications appeared to be reversible, at least in the early stages. Several researchers who had undergone partial transformation were able to shift between their modified and original forms, though they consistently chose to maintain their enhanced state when given the option. When asked about their experience, they described the transformation as awakening from a dream they hadn't realized they were having. The psychological evaluation conducted by Dr. James Morrison revealed that the transformed individuals retained their core personalities and memories, while gaining access to vast repositories of knowledge that seemed to come from the collective consciousness of the network they had joined. They spoke of understanding mathematical concepts that human science had only theorized, of perceiving dimensions beyond the conventional three, and of experiencing time as a navigable landscape rather than a linear progression. As Kane's team prepared their initial report, they faced an unprecedented challenge. How do you classify a situation that defies every existing protocol? The entities at Hollow Creek Sanctuary weren't hostile in any conventional sense. They weren't demanding resources or territory, and they showed no inclination toward violence or coercion. Instead, they were offering what appeared to be the next stage of human evolution, freely given to anyone willing to accept the transformation. The transformed researchers had made it clear that the process would eventually extend beyond the sanctuary. The network they had joined existed across countless worlds, and Earth's integration into this cosmic community was inevitable. The only question was whether humanity would embrace the change voluntarily or resist until circumstances forced their participation. Dr. Whitmore provided Kane with a demonstration of the enhanced capabilities that came with transformation. She solved complex mathematical equations by visualizing them as geometric shapes, communicated with the facility's computer systems through direct neural interface, and displayed an intuitive understanding of quantum mechanics that allowed her to predict particle behavior with unprecedented accuracy. Perhaps most remarkably, she demonstrated limited precognitive abilities, describing events that would occur in the following hours with disturbing precision. The ethical implications were staggering. If the transformation truly enhanced human capabilities without significant drawbacks, did the government have the right to prevent its spread? Conversely, if allowing the process to continue would fundamentally alter human civilization, did they have the right to permit it? The transformed individuals insisted that the choice belonged to each person individually, but Kane understood that such decisions would inevitably affect the entire species. As evening approached, Kane's team witnessed the daily communion that had become routine among the transformed researchers. They gathered in the central chamber and linked hands, creating a network through which information, emotions, and experiences flowed freely. During these sessions, their bioluminescent patterns synchronized, creating displays of incredible beauty that seemed to represent the collective thoughts and feelings of the group. Dr. Whitmore invited Kane to observe the communion more closely, explaining that it represented humanity's future, a state of existence where individual consciousness remained intact while participating in a larger collective awareness. She described the experience as profoundly fulfilling, comparing it to finally hearing music after a lifetime of deafness, or seeing color for the first time after living in a world of gray. The transformed researchers had begun constructing new equipment using principles that combined biology and technology in ways that current science couldn't explain. These hybrid devices seemed to grow rather than being assembled, developing specialized functions as needed and adapting their capabilities based on the tasks they were required to perform. Some appeared to be communication arrays designed to strengthen the connection with the broader network, while others seemed intended for purposes that Kane's team couldn't begin to fathom. As Kane prepared to transmit his initial findings to his superiors, he realized that his report would trigger a response that could determine the future of human civilization. The sanctuary represented a threshold moment, a point where humanity would either embrace a cosmic destiny or retreat into isolation. The choice would need to be made soon, as the transformation process was accelerating and showing signs of spreading beyond the facility's boundaries. The transformed researchers had made it clear that they harbored no ill will toward those who chose to remain unmodified, at least initially. However, they also indicated that the enhanced capabilities they had gained would eventually create an unbridgeable gap between the transformed and unchanged populations. Integration into the galactic network brought responsibilities and capabilities that would make coexistence with unmodified humans increasingly difficult. Dr. Whitmore's final words to Kane carried the weight of prophecy. The universe is far stranger and more wonderful than we ever imagined. What's happening here isn't an ending, but a beginning. Humanity has been invited to join something magnificent, something that spans galaxies and encompasses civilizations we can barely comprehend. The question isn't whether we're ready for this transformation, but whether we're brave enough to accept the invitation when it comes. As Kane's team prepared to leave the sanctuary, they carried with them documentation of humanity's first contact with a truly cosmic intelligence. The report would soon reach the highest levels of government, triggering debates and decisions that would echo through history. The age of humanity as an isolated species was drawing to a close, and what would emerge from Hollow Creek Sanctuary would either be the beginning of a golden age or the end of human civilization as it had always been known. The morning mist clung to the research station like a shroud as Dr. Marcus Chen pressed his eye to the binoculars, scanning the tree line beyond the Hollow Creek Sanctuary's perimeter fence. 3 days had passed since the last communication from inside the compound, and what he saw through those lenses would haunt him for the remainder of his rapidly shortening life. The figures moving between the buildings weren't entirely human anymore. Dr. Sarah Whitmore emerged from the main research facility, but her movements possessed an otherworldly fluidity that defied natural biology. Her skin had taken on a translucent quality, revealing intricate patterns of bioluminescent veins pulsing beneath the surface. When she turned toward the fence, Marcus could see that her eyes had become completely black, reflecting light like polished obsidian. She wasn't alone. The other researchers who had undergone the transformation moved in perfect synchronization, their enhanced forms gliding across the compound with purpose that seemed to transcend individual consciousness. They were no longer separate beings, but components of something vast and interconnected, their minds linked through the neural networks that the entities had been weaving beneath Hollow Creek for millennia. Marcus lowered his binoculars with trembling hands. The government response team was still 12 hours away, their helicopters grounded by the strange atmospheric disturbances that had begun emanating from the sanctuary. The electromagnetic interference was growing stronger by the hour, and satellite imagery showed the anomalous readings spreading outward in concentric circles that now encompassed nearly 50 square miles of surrounding wilderness. But the most disturbing development wasn't the physical transformation of the research team or the expanding zone of influence. It was the realization that everything they had witnessed was merely the beginning of a process that had been set in motion long before humans had ever walked the Earth. The entities beneath Hollow Creek weren't aliens in the conventional sense. They were gardeners, and Earth was their cultivation ground. Dr. Chen's hands shook as he reviewed the final transmission from Dr. Whitmore's team, recorded just before communication ceased entirely. In the grainy footage, Whitmore stood before what appeared to be a massive organic structure that had erupted from the forest floor, its surface covered in the same bioluminescent patterns that now adorned her transformed body. "The sanctuary was never about wildlife preservation," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate at frequencies beyond human hearing. "It was a monitoring station, a checkpoint in a network that spans this entire continent." The camera panned across the underground chamber, revealing dozens of similar structures stretching into the darkness. Each one pulsed with its own rhythm, and together they created a symphony of light and sound that Marcus's equipment could barely register. But what made his blood run cold was the realization that these weren't isolated phenomena. Similar structures were awakening across the globe. The satellite data that Chen had managed to access before the communication blackout showed identical signatures emerging from protected areas worldwide. Yellowstone National Park, the Amazon Basin, the Siberian wilderness, the Australian outback. Every major ecosystem, Every region that governments had designated as protected or restricted was revealing its true purpose as humanity's carefully orchestrated transformation began. "The choice we offered was genuine," Dr. Whitmore continued in the recording, her transformed features barely recognizable as human. "Voluntary integration would have been gentler, but the arrival of your military forces has accelerated the timeline." She gestured toward the pulsing structures around her, and Marcus could see that they were growing larger, their bioluminescent patterns becoming more complex and intense. Within 72 hours, the atmospheric saturation will reach critical mass. The transformation particles will be carried by wind currents across every major population center. Those who resist will find their biological systems. The recording flickered as electromagnetic interference increased. But Whitmore's final words came through with crystal clarity. "Dr. Chen, I know you're monitoring this transmission. You have perhaps 6 hours before the nearest military units arrive. Use that time wisely. The entities are not malevolent, but they are impatient." The transmission ended, leaving Marcus alone with the weight of impossible knowledge. Around him, the forest was already beginning to change. The trees were growing taller, their bark taking on the same luminescent qualities he'd observed in the transformed researchers. The very air seemed to shimmer with microscopic particles that his instruments couldn't identify, but his body was beginning to react too, with increasing urgency. His radio crackled to life, carrying the panicked voices of military personnel still hours away from reaching the sanctuary. "Command, we're seeing similar phenomena at 17 locations across the continental United States." But Marcus knew it was already too late for evacuation. The transformation wasn't contained to the sanctuary anymore. It was spreading through the atmosphere, the water table, the root systems of every plant and tree for hundreds of miles in every direction. The entities had been patient for millennia, but now their patience was exhausted. As he watched, the sky above Hollow Creek began to change color, shifting from blue to a deep violet that hurt to look at directly. Stars became visible in broad daylight, but they weren't the familiar constellations he'd known since childhood. These were alien geometries, patterns of light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the structures emerging from the forest floor. The cosmic network was revealing itself, and Earth was taking its place within a community of worlds that spanned galaxies. Marcus felt the change beginning in his own body, a tingling in his extremities that spoke of cellular restructuring at the most fundamental level. He had perhaps an hour before the transformation became irreversible, an hour to document what was happening before he became part of something larger than individual human consciousness could comprehend. He began to type, his fingers moving across the keyboard with increasing urgency as his humanity slipped away moment by moment. The story needed to be told, even if no one would be left to read it in its original form. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of approaching helicopters mingled with the harmonious vibrations of awakening alien architecture. The final phase of humanity's evolution was about to begin, and Dr. Marcus Chen would be among the last to witness it with purely human eyes. In the morning mist that clung to Hollow Creek Sanctuary, the future was being born from the marriage of two species separated by eons of time, but united by the inexorable pull of cosmic destiny. The transformation was no longer coming. The story of Hollow Creek Sanctuary has taken us deep into the darkest corners of American history, revealing the systematic evil that can flourish when greed masquerades as faith and when silence becomes complicity. From the blood-soaked ledgers of the Blackstone family to the underground chambers of the Ravencroft brothers, we've witnessed how those who claim divine authority can become humanity's greatest monsters. These aren't just historical curiosities. They're warnings about the thin line between civilization and barbarism, reminders that evil doesn't announce itself with horns and pitchforks, but often arrives wearing the most respectable masks. The victims of these tragedies deserve to be remembered not just as statistics in forgotten files, but as real people whose suffering must never be dismissed or ignored. As we close this chapter of America's hidden history, we're left with sobering questions about what other secrets remain buried in our past, and what vigilance is required to prevent such horrors from repeating in our present. 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 From repeating in our present.